We all are witnessing a piece of UFC history here tonight.
This place is deafening right now.
I got chills, man. I can't believe it's really going to happen. It is going to happen.
So it sounds trite, but Madison Square Garden is the Mecca. It is the world's most famous arena. And even for a Boston kid, I can understand the value of that arena. This is actually the fourth iteration of Madison Square Garden that opened in 1978, but a lot of famous boxing matches there in the 1950s. And I think if you were to poll our roster, top to bottom, 1 through 650, man or woman, if they could compete in one arena, I think for a lot of them, it would be Madison Square Garden.
New York is like the epicenter of the world, so it's the pinnacle of fighting is to fight at MSG.
When you're someone growing up watching combat sport, if there's one arena that you want to throw down in, it's Madison Square Garden.
So UFC 205 was really peak Conor McGregor, and certainly it stands to reason that he could get back to that level. But he had come off the series with Nate Diaz, made a relatively quick turn here in trying to become the double champion. And as we sit here 7-8 years later, Conor McGregor is still ubiquitously regarded as the biggest mixed martial arts superstar of all time. And I don't know that anybody's ever going to take that baton from the man.
Conor is the man. I love his style. I love his attitude.
There's always a lot of anticipation around his fights, how it's gonna go. He talks a lot, he's confident.
You might not be a fan, maybe you might be a fan, but it's hard not to watch him.
Here he was, trying to do what no UFC champion had ever done before, which is to simultaneously lay claim to a belt in two divisions. Conor McGregor ultimately became the first simultaneous two-division champion in UFC history and honestly laid the infrastructure and the foundation for what became a double champ era. A lot of other champions had the opportunity to realize that same dream that Conor was able to execute that night at Madison Square Garden. But I don't know that McGregor-Mania ever was at a fever pitch quite like it was for UFC 205 at MSG late 2016. So there are a lot of big moments at UFC 205, but among those that really jumped out at me was Joanna Jędrzejczyk, fourth defense of her UFC strawweight championship, and man, did she put it on her countrywoman Karolina Kowalkiewicz, right? There was no taking it easy on her fellow Pole.
Before fight with JJ, I was very big underdog, but I give really good fight with five rounds.
Joanna, the first female fighter that I was like, wow, that girl was scary. She was a true champion through her career.
Even though she's no longer the champion, even though she's semi-retired, she was drawing comparisons to Chuck the Iceman Liddell back in the day, just in terms of the power and the striking and the overall approach. And here we are about a decade later, and she still retains a lot of that praise. There hasn't been a second coming of her in the division. We talk a lot about the depth at strawweight, but no one has put together a championship reign quite like Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Khabib Nurmagomedov, he was still sort of cutting his UFC teeth at that point in time. It was his 8th UFC appearance, but he was able to submit Michael Johnson with a Kimura, and that was one of the more memorable things that I thought happened at UFC 205. Conor obviously took an extended hiatus from mixed martial arts thereafter, but when he did return, his next fight after Eddie Alvarez, of course, came against the great Khabib Nurmagomedov. So DraftKings is affording a lot of us with the UFC an opportunity to look back at some of the more seminal live events in UFC history. And even though I was not on the call for UFC 205 at Madison Square Garden in 2016, I still think you can lay out an argument that that was the most significant night in UFC history. First time for the combat sports leader in New York City. What felt like an eventuality finally came to fruition. And of course, the deck was stacked, the fight card over-delivered, and that's why here we are several years later, waxing poetic about UFC 205.